The year is 1991. Nintendo released the Super Famicom in Japan just the year before, and by this point there were two truly huge fantasy role-playing game franchises vying for space on store shelves and in the heads of the people who bought and played them. Square's Final Fantasy and Enix's Dragon Quest. Although Dragon Quest came into existence a year and a half before Final Fantasy did, the first three titles in each would release on the original Nintendo Famicom and grew in popularity as time went on. Things might not have been smooth sailing on all fronts, but in the end both franchises came out swinging with a huge number of fans loving the games for different yet similar reasons. However, there was one big moment that signalled a point at which things would diverge. In 1990, Dragon Quest IV would release on the Famicom, whilst Chunsoft would wait a little while to develop the eventual Dragon Quest V, the last game they would work on in the series, for the Super Famicom to be released in 1992. Square, however, had two ongoing projects in the Final Fantasy series by this point, one intended for the Famicom and the other for the Super Famicom. However, despite how far along in development it was, budgetary constraints would result in the Famicom project being shelved, and work continued instead on the Super Famicom game, making use of a number of ideas and concepts from the cancelled Famicom game. The end result was a game that would lead the way for a change in identity for Final Fantasy as a series. It introduced new mechanics alongside a gameplay philosophy that wasn't common at the time, and it was all brought together in a genuinely impressive package that's fun to play even 30 years on from its release. This is Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV is a turn-based role-playing game that sees you traversing through different worlds on a journey to discover your true self and defeat the big evil bad guy. These days this would come across as advertising copy for Persona 4 or something, but the basic concept behind the game's story was quite unique for the time, even if it wasn't the most original idea necessarily. Breaking free from the shackles that the original Famicom imposed upon the previous three Final Fantasy entries, Square went in on the Super Famicom with some new ideas for the gameplay, some of which would be staples of the series for a long time. Combine the fun and fresh gameplay with an enjoyable and rollicking, if occasionally contrived narrative, and you have a game that is surely among the best of the early days of the console's life, and the performance of the game in Japan is a clear indicator of that. Final Fantasy IV shifted approximately 200,000 units in its first day at retail, with lifetime sales figures somewhere close to 1.5 million copies sold in Japan for the Super Famicom. Final Fantasy III sold a similar figure. Its success in Japan would eventually see a localization for North American audiences, but it wasn't hugely successful, nor did it release without alterations. Final Fantasy IV released in North America as Final Fantasy II, since neither the Famicom FF2 or FF3 released there, and instead Square opted to maintain naming continuity, something they would do again for Final Fantasy VI, as they would release it as Final Fantasy III in North America. This practice would come to a stop when Final Fantasy VII saw a worldwide release though. Anyway, it not only sold pretty well in Japan at the time, but it was also received very well indeed. The dramatic presentation, narrative, unique gameplay ideas for the time, attractive visuals, and an impressively well realised soundtrack mark Final Fantasy IV as not just a good game, but a great game. But what exactly makes this game great? I've talked about unique gameplay ideas this, and dramatic presentation that, but what does that all mean? And besides, what version of the game is the one to get if it's so great? Well, we're about to go into all of this, but firstly, let's have a look at the game's packaging. As we take a look at the packaging for this game, we see something quite unlike the previous Final Fantasy entries. You see, for previous entries, the box art consisted of an illustration by artist Yoshitaka Amano, complete with a somewhat difficult to parse but interestingly designed logo. The Amano design covers look fantastic, and it should come as little wonder that he's been involved in some way with many of the entries of the series, providing the Final Fantasy franchise a visual trademark via his inimitable style. But that's mostly missing here on the box art for Final Fantasy IV. Instead, we get chibified renditions of a few of the characters in the game, courtesy of artist Kazuko Shibuya. She was responsible for much of the graphics that you see in the Final Fantasy games, but her involvement in this one was mostly limited to this cover, as she was working on Final Fantasy V, and if you know how much work that took, you'll know that it's a lot. A full year to make all those character sprites. As a result, it might seem a bit odd that I mentioned this show's characters. We have someone who can be identified as Rosa, another who can be identified as Edge, maybe the knight up front is Cecil? But we don't get a normal white mage or black mage in the party at all, so that's a bit odd. Amano does have a presence on this cover at least, in the form of the logo hovering just above these guys. This is the game which gave birth to the iconic logo design for Final Fantasy as a series, and ever since this entry, this basic design concept appeared across the rest of the franchise, complete with an illustration as part of the logo, such as the Dragoon here. With the square logo at the bottom to round off the front of the box, it's a cover that looks a little bit odd, like it clashes in a number of ways, but on the whole it sells the basic idea well enough. It's fantasy, there's swords, magic, grossly overgrown chicks, and so on. Anyway, we move on to the back and we are greeted with yet more of Amano's illustration work, albeit as a backdrop to a wall of text. Said wall of text gives a bit of ominous background on what the game's story entails, but over on the right we also see some screenshots accompanied by yet more text. If there is one thing the back of this box is communicating to us, it's that we can expect a great deal of text in this game, which you might already expect by virtue of this being a role-playing game where the story and the presentation thereof can take centre stage at times. We look inside of this moderately crumpled box to find the contents consisting of a game cartridge, an advice slip, and a manual. We'll check the cartridge out in a few moments, but firstly let's have a quick look through the manual. The pages within provide us with a few illustrations from Amano and Shibuya, but also a lot of images and text that explain to us a variety of subjects, such as the world in which the game takes place, the controls, the gameplay systems, the different characters and what they can do, and an explanation of what the different magic spells and items do towards the back of the manual. It is a solidly in-depth manual in places, which doesn't surprise me too much, given the relative mechanical complexity of this game compared to the ones that came before it, but I would be skipping ahead somewhat, so let's not go too far into it yet. So, the cartridge. It uses a 1A3B-11 PCB, consists of 7 resistors of 3 different resistances, 2 diodes, 2 capacitors, a transistor, a battery, and 4 chips. 1 ROM chip, 1 region lockout chip, 1 SRAM chip, and a transistor logic chip. Given the games that I've got which were released contemporaneously to this, it's a standard cartridge configuration that allowed the game to be pretty advanced in some ways, without worrying too much about whether it would be too complex. Not that there weren't limitations in the end, but that's for later. For now, let's reassemble this cartridge, but before I pop it into the Super Famicom, I do want to talk very briefly about what this game is to me personally. Final Fantasy IV is a game that I am pretty solidly familiar with overall for a number of reasons, and therefore it is one of the RPGs I am most familiar with. Where games I have an intimate knowledge of are concerned, this is up there with the likes of Fear, Super Metroid, and Persona 3. Although I don't love everything about this game, it is one I think I am able to discuss at length through a critical lens and talk about exactly what makes it tick in the end. With this having been said, it is time to put the cartridge into the slot and begin playing Final Fantasy IV. As we start Final Fantasy IV, we are given a somewhat static title screen featuring the game's logo type and a glinting crystal. The background music is quite familiar to anyone who has played past Final Fantasy games, until it develops into something more. But now, let's begin a new game. We see a fleet of airships heading north, and very shortly in, we find ourselves on one of these airships. On board this airship is the commander, Cecil. Cecil is having a moment of internal conflict after he conducted an abnormally aggressive mission to acquire the water crystal from Mysidia. On the way home, the airships are accosted by a few beasts, but they're trivially easy to take down, so much so in fact that the game simply does it for us. After all is said and done, Cecil makes landfall and comes home to the kingdom he pledged to protect, Baron. He reports to Bagan, who at once prepares the king for an audience with him, although he comments that Cecil isn't exactly content with the situation he's in. Nonetheless, Cecil has his audience with the king, hands the water crystal over, and prepares to leave, until Cecil asks the king what exactly his intentions are. Traditionally, it's a bad idea to question the authority of your superior, and in doing so, the king doubts Cecil's loyalty and strips him of his rank as commander of the Red Wings. Cecil's friend Cain barges into the throne room to try and cool the situation, but instead all it does is put the pair out to pasture. Cecil and Cain are both given a mission to go to the nearby village of Mist to deliver a ring. They head out tomorrow, so Cecil heads out to his quarters, although Rosa and Cid speak to him as he makes his way there, both in shock about Cecil losing his commander's standing. In the end, Cecil gets into bed, and just as he finds himself lost in thought, Cecil's love, Rosa, walks in and tries to put his mind at ease, but doesn't entirely succeed. Nonetheless, once she departs from the bedroom, Cecil goes to sleep before waking up in the morning, meeting with Cain, and beginning a journey that would awaken them both. Upon leaving Baron, we find ourselves on an overworld map with a few places we can walk around and explore. Although we have only one actual destination to go to, but before we touch on that, I think I should explain the simple gameplay loop that you go through. The intricacies will come later, but we get a vertical slice of what to expect very early on. As you walk around on the overworld or in dungeons, you'll be at risk of a random encounter with some monsters. Once this happens, you are thrown into battle against them, and you need to deal with the monsters by whatever means necessary, mainly a combination of weapon-based attacks and the casting of magic. If you beat them before they beat you, you exit the battle screen with money, experience points, and the occasional items for your troubles. All the while, you'll be rummaging around trying to find your way to the next objective. You'll find your way to settlements like towns or castles, talk to numerous NPCs, some of whom may provide you with an objective or a clue on what to do next, stay at an inn to recuperate lost health and magic points, stock up on items, kit out with new weapons and armour, and be back on your merry way. It's a fairly traditional gameplay loop that many turn-based RPGs of the era had, and one could be forgiven for thinking this makes for a somewhat by-the-numbers game in the end. However, Final Fantasy IV does a lot of things that I think elevate it above most other RPGs of its time. So let's get into some of the minutiae of what makes this game so good. The biggest changes begin in the battle screen, where the meat of the gameplay takes place. On the face of it, things look rather straightforward. You have your party to the right, enemies to the left, and if you eliminate all the enemies on the left before they eliminate you, you win and can make progress. This is done by making use of weapons, which consist of different types that each character can make use of, from swords, spears, claws, whips, bows and arrows, staves, rods, and so on, with some of these causing different amounts of damage based on a few character statistics. Most characters have a dominant hand, but characters can often hold more than one thing in their hands. In Cecil's case, he can hold a sword in his dominant hand and a shield in the other, and other characters like Yang can hold two kinds of claws. Some weapons are specific to a given character, whilst other weapons can be handed to several characters, such as bows, daggers, staves and rods. Some characters are capable of casting magic, which comes in two main varieties: white magic for restorative or defensive spells, and black magic for offensive spells, although there is an amount of crossover between the two types. You will mainly be using the elemental black magic spells to damage with the power of fire, lightning and ice, as well as inflicting status-affecting ailments, like enemies being turned into pigs or toads. And white magic will be used to revive, cure or otherwise support the party with an assortment of buffs such as protection spells. There are also character-specific actions that can be performed, such as Yang performing a sweeping kick on all enemies, Cecil making use of darkness which has a similar effect, Rydia summoning Eidolons, Cain being able to jump and plunge into enemies with great force, and so on. One key part of battles is the way in which you arrange your party. Your party is arranged in a 5-character zigzag, allowing you to put 3 characters in the front and 2 in the back, or 2 in the front and 3 in the back. There are a few considerations there, of course, chief among which is what your party composition is best at dealing with. As certain characters have innate traits in combat, you have to determine whether to place them in the firing line or huddle them behind everyone else to make them less likely to be hit as severely as those in front. The different kinds of weapons are affected by party positioning as well. As arrows and thrown weapons are projectiles and not melee weapons, they will be able to travel further than attacks from swords and the like, so placing characters according to their weapon will allow you to deal more damage than if you paid no attention to party makeup. There is the option to escape a battle that you either don't want to engage in or fear that you might not win, by holding down both L and R shoulder buttons. As long as both buttons are held down, however, the enemies can still attack, but hopefully you escape with your life before the enemies cruelly take it away from you, even if you drop some of your money as you elope. Provided you don't run away, however, at the end of each battle, experience points, money and occasionally some items are rewarded. With enough experience points, party members can level up, giving them an increase to their max health, their max magic points if applicable, and other stats to make them more potent in battle. All of this touches on a detail about the characters in Final Fantasy IV that I will hold off on going over until a fair bit later on, but suffice it to say, this helps to provide the game with a healthy amount of complexity without going overboard and making it unnecessarily difficult for newcomers, especially when all the characters are visually distinct from one another. Mostly. Something I want to mention with regards to battles are the different scenarios that can take place using the battle screen. Story sequences can take place in these as a way to show an ongoing struggle or allow some light storytelling within these battles. The tides can change during these kinds of fights, characters can let out their anger and frustration on the target, and players can expect this technique to be made use of not just in this game, but also the next few Final Fantasy games. There is something that separates this game from previous Final Fantasy games, however, and for that matter other RPGs released before this. Allow me to introduce to you the mechanic that changed Final Fantasy as a franchise for the entirety of the 1990s. The way combat worked in past Final Fantasy games is as follows. You, as the player, set your entire party's actions, and once everyone's moves have been selected, the battle plays out with the party's and enemies' moves interleaved based on certain stats. Once everyone has performed their actions, if enemies remain, everyone sets up for another round. In Final Fantasy IV, battles would take place with the use of a system called Active Time Battle. ATB, as I will refer to it herein, is a system that makes use of time to charge a given character or enemy's turn. Each character and enemy has a variable that ticks up until it reaches a maximum point, allowing for an action to be set and carried out independent of everyone else. Once an action has been carried out, the variable resets and ticks up again. The upshot of ATB is that battles become tremendously more fluid than they have ever been in the series, and more engaging as a result. This is one of the ways that going from 8-bit systems like the Famicom to 16-bit systems like the Super Famicom has drastically improved the gameplay, as older systems would have struggled with handling such a mechanic. Because of the ATB and the resulting fluidity of the gameplay, battles can feel and be a lot faster than in previous games. A boss fight in a previous Final Fantasy game, for example, can feel markedly pedestrian compared to what Final Fantasy IV can provide. It can also lend you a tremendous amount more tension to a battle than past entries, because you have less of a window of opportunity to get a move going on an enemy before they can attack you. The game can surprise you and keep you in a healthy amount of suspense during battles, and it's all the better for it. Thanks to just how fun the ATB is as a mechanic, Square took the decision to make use of it, with incremental improvements, for the next 5 installments in the Final Fantasy franchise. And even in an era where the system itself might be seen as outdated, there are little parts of it that remain in some newer games. Perhaps the best thing this game permits with the ATB is the option to tweak the settings slightly. You can set it to wait, enemies have to wait to engage you if you're selecting an action, or active, enemies can engage you whilst you're making your move. And you can modify the speed of battles. This is the closest thing this game has to a difficulty select, and you can tailor it as you see fit to your preference. Want a slightly more sedate but no less challenging experience? Set it to weight in a higher number and you'll be quite comfortable. Want something that'll really test your reactions? Active will give you a good go regardless of what number you pick, though one can get unwieldy. In my case, I just set it to weight and free for comfortable enough yet pleasantly challenging battles. Ultimately, Final Fantasy IV's battle gameplay is, in my opinion, the thing that makes it stand out over many of its contemporaries, because of the wonderfully crafted mix of the ATB and the different roles your party members can fulfill. It's a beautifully organised system all around, and I can't really think of anything to be particularly critical of regarding it. Actually, there are a couple things I can criticise, in that sometimes high enemy counts can cause battles to almost grind to a halt with how many moves the enemies can end up making, and battle messages can take a while to go through at slower battle speeds. But in the end, it's not a massive deal. They happen occasionally enough for me to mention them, but I'm not going to criticise the game too harshly for a couple mild annoyances. And, to be fair, this is the first game in the series to try this system out, so of course there might be creases to iron out later, but for a first iteration, I'd say it works well. So now that I have gone on at length over the battle system, let's talk about some mechanics that exist away from the battle screen. Whilst a substantial portion of the game takes place within said battle screen, you've still got some exploring to do. As you start out the game, remembering that Cecil doesn't have the luxury of an airship anymore, now that the king has stripped him of his captaincy, your only real option is to walk to your objective, which happens to be a cave. However, there are some landmarks around this first area to check out. Just outside of Baron Castle on this fairly large island is the town of Baron itself, but to the south is a group of mountains preventing further southerly progress. Connecting this island to a massive continent are a few bridges, enabling us passage to our eventual goal, which lies beyond some forested northern regions around Baron. This cave gives us some useful insight into what to expect with the dungeons in Final Fantasy IV, and for now, this section will detail how dungeons work in this game, as you will spend the bulk of your playtime in places like these. In many locations in these dungeons, you will chance upon enemy encounters that you will need to deal with in the ways that you see fit. But there's more to these dungeons than simply bothering the native wildlife for their lunch money. Usually dotted around the dungeons are chests that contain an item. Often they will be consumable items like potions or ethers, but sometimes there will be items that can be used in battle, or weapons or armour. Do be careful though, as some chests can have monsters in them alongside the item within. In some dungeons, and in a number of non-dungeon areas such as in castles or buildings within towns, you can find yourself walking through false walls that lead you through a secret passageway, oftentimes bringing you to something like a treasure chest which may have something particularly valuable in it. Stuff like this feels very quaint. Whilst it gets the player checking every single corner of the map to ensure they're not leaving any stone unturned, it does feel at odds with one of this game's core concepts, the brisk pace of progression, aided in no small part by the unrequirement of grinding in Final Fantasy IV. Whilst there are times where searching every nook and cranny for a lowly potion can be a bit tedious, it only really feels like that because the pacing of the game is as fast as it is already that it can feel a bit stop-start. With that said, however, as you progress through the dungeon and reach the end, or perhaps close to it, you may encounter a boss fight which pits you against a particularly strong foe, with abilities that are not to be ignored. The first boss you encounter is the Mist Dragon, which explains, on top of the fact that we're en route to the village of Mist, why this cave is all misty. It's a boss that eases the player into what to expect with Final Fantasy IV, as it changes into a veil of mist after enough time passes, and attacking it in its mist form is a self-destructive exercise. More on bosses later. For now though, it would do us well if we took a bit of a rest stop at this here save point and set a bivouac up to catch a few Zeds. Through most dungeons there will be protected areas where you can save your game and make use of a tent or a cottage to recover health and magic points. The tent restores your health fully early on, but once you start playing with a lot of magic, tents won't cut it terribly well, as they only restore so much magic at a time. Cottages will restore your entire party's condition, reviving incapacitated characters and healing any maladies anyone might be suffering from. This is something you can do in inns as well for a price. Resting at an inn in towns or castles will confer the same benefits as a cottage, so you've plenty of options to make sure your party is fighting fit in Final Fantasy IV. Oh god, that also sounds like advertising copy. So, let's talk about grabbing some new gear. As you progress through the game, you'll want to improve your kit. Generally speaking, the better your weapons and armour, the better you can deal out beatings and take them in kind. Equipment affects many stats that each character has, such as attack power, defense, accuracy, magic power, magic resistance, evasion, and so on. Swapping out different pieces of equipment can alter the wearer's properties, affecting their potency in battle. Equipment can also have particular properties that can be an advantage or disadvantage. As an example, you might come across armour that provides a great increase in defense against ice attacks, which is pretty handy when the boss purges you with fire. Of course, weapons can have elemental properties to them as well. Arrows will tend to have some sort of property to them that causes element-based damage or some other status effect, like sleeping, silence, poison, or petrification. Yang's claws have a similar effect, as can spears, swords, axes, staves, and rods. Because these weapons can have different kinds of properties and effects, it allows for a lot of freedom in how you set your party up to exploit particular weaknesses or defend against particular enemy attacks. This comes in quite handy when you have to equip your party with certain kinds of equipment for one dungeon. Also, because of these effects, some of these weapons can also be made use of as items during battle, as you can not only swap weapons in the middle of a fight, but also, in the case of staves and rods, use them to cast magic without any cost to your magic points, something that can be especially useful if you are running dry or simply want to conserve it for later. Now to talk about one particular quirk that is present in Final Fantasy IV. It's something that serves as a slight reminder of just how old this game is, and that is the way in which the inventory system works. In previous Final Fantasy games on the Famicom, you had an inventory limit of 32 items. In part, this was due to the system the games were made for, so technical limitations restricted how much you could carry. Final Fantasy IV, however, didn't have quite the same problem, in that you could carry up to 48 different stacks of items, a 50% increase in capacity compared to past games, thus alleviating a few anxieties with regards to your inventory capacity. That said, from the midpoint onwards, it can sometimes feel like you're straining for some space to store anything you pick up. The further along you go, the greater the number of different collectible and purchasable items becomes, so you need to keep an eye on just how much you can carry. So, how do you manage your inventory? Well, there are a few things you can do. If you buy items from a shop, you can buy any number between 1 and 99 of a given thing, and each purchase will add a whole new stack to your inventory. To consolidate and rearrange stacks, you can go into your inventory, scroll down to the bottom, and hit the sort button to organise things automatically. Of course, if you reach the point where you have a full inventory and can't make any space without disposing of something, you won't be able to buy anything, even if you have a partial stack of that thing already. Instead, if you're at a shop already, you can sell some stuff to make some room for yet more stuff. If you aren't at a shop, however, and you pick an item up that you don't have the space for, you have the option to drop either an existing inventory item or the item you're attempting to pick up. Fortunately, in these menus, if you pick something that you already have a stack of in your inventory, it gets added to the stack. Also, you can just drop an item at any time in the inventory menu if you feel it necessary. There is another option, however. In some places, like chocobo forests and other conspicuous spaces, if you use some Gisal greens, you'll summon a fat chocobo. In this big funky goober, you can stash anything you don't want on you at that moment, but want to keep just in case it comes in handy later on. To be completely honest, I'm not sure I'm a fan of the way in which the inventory is handled. It is cool how you can effectively carry nearly 5,000 of one particular item if you really wanted to, but it has the feeling of a disparate system with a bunch of ideas that weren't fully realised. The ability to rearrange your inventory and stack things appropriately is neat, but it would have been better if the sorting mechanics were more varied, such as sorting based on item type. But hey, at least the inventory is bigger now? I wonder what is to blame here, because Final Fantasy IV was developed by a startlingly small team for such a game of its scale, consisting of 14 people over the course of a year. Perhaps they didn't have the time to polish that system and figured a few simple features would suffice? Anyway, throughout your journey in Final Fantasy IV, you will make use of myriad different modes of transport in order to traverse the world. Each one has its benefits, drawbacks and quirks that you'll get used to and come to appreciate when you need them. The first form of transport you gain access to is a hovercraft, which is used for speedy traversal across solid ground, and you can ford shallow rocky waters with it. This can come in handy late on in the game, but early on, you'll do a couple simple things with it before moving on to the next hotness, the airship. Since Cecil is, or more accurately was, an airship commander, you'll end up feeling right at home being able to freely navigate the world in an impressively powerful vessel known as the Enterprise. Come and go from the land to the skies and cross great distances with consummate ease. Just don't expect to land in mountain ranges or forests. You will later encounter a few other kinds of vessel you can make use of, including a wholly different kind of airship. When you find yourself in the underworld, as opposed to the overworld we've talked about so far, you'll notice there's a lot of lava around, restricting where you can go early on, as flying over the hot source will require some plating on the ship. Once you do get such plating on the Falcon, as this vessel is called, you can cross the lava and truly explore underground. Because of the persistent nature of these vehicles, you can make use of them whenever you want, provided they haven't been affected by any particular story events that take place as you play the game. This comes to the fore when you get the Enterprise upgraded so that you can carry the hovercraft with you. It's probable you hadn't used it since you went up a mountain, but now you can carry it with you and check out places that you have not yet ventured. Would it be fair to refer to the chocobo as a means of transport? Because it sure fits the bill. In certain forests you can enter a clearing inhabited by seemingly wild chocobos. Catch one and you can use it to run around for a bit. If you get off though, it will return to the forest. Except for the black chocobo, which can fly over shallow waters. There is one more vehicle I could mention here, but I think I would be going too far at this point regarding the story, so I'll summarise the above by saying the options the game provides you for traversing the worlds you explore are rather good and effective, even if there is arguably a bit of redundancy at times. I think now would be a great time to shift gears and talk about the presentation of this game, particularly with regards to its sound and, for the immediate moment, the graphics. There is some context I should apply here before going any further, however. As explained already, Final Fantasy IV released in 1991, within the first year of the Super Famicom's life. Putting this into consideration, you'll notice that the graphics, compared to later games, can look a little rustic. With that having been said, it's a bit unfair to look at the game in the eyes of future games, since by that point the developers would have had a better understanding of what the Super Famicom was capable of, on top of being better able to present games with the scope they want to showcase. Final Fantasy IV is quaint, but it's a kind of quaint that's interesting to look at. If we compare with past Final Fantasy games for a second, we can see that Final Fantasy IV makes some substantial changes to the way in which things are presented in general, even on the overworld, and we get a glimpse of that as early as the very start of the game. The opening of the game showcases the Super Famicom's unique Mode 7 background mode, which enabled developers to create a large background layer and manipulate it in interesting ways. You can warp it, skew it, and do all sorts of things to it, with the upshot being that it can be used to provide a pseudo 3D effect to the way the game looks. F-Zero and Super Mario Kart are good examples of this in practice. In that opening scene, you feel like you're flying over the open seas because the way in which the game presents the perspective of where the airships are in relation to the water fills in the blanks that the Famicom never could for past Final Fantasy entries. One other thing to note is how the game is a little more colourful than past entries. This is the technical leap at play, where previously Famicom sprites were limited to 4 colours per 8x8 sprite, with one of those colours being a transparent colour if need be. Not a lot of room to work with, although they did what they could. With the Super Famicom, however, a sprite can have up to 16 colours, one also being a transparent colour if needed, and different sprite sizes were possible as well, although in this game that doesn't factor in all that much. Really, it's the colours that matter more here. The Super Famicom's ability to display more colours allows it to improve the level of detail in both the character sprites and background tiles. Whilst the sprites in Final Fantasy Ⅳ can surprise in just how much detail they could pack in on the Famicom, Final Fantasy IV shows a start of Square experimenting on what they could do on the new and improved hardware. It isn't a perfect start by any means. There are occasions where the tiling can look off, like in certain areas in the underworld, but if I went through every game complaining about something like this, I'd be unbearable to listen to. It's fine, really. So let's talk about the character and enemy sprites. The sprite work for the characters enables each of them to stand out in a way that distinguishes not just who each character is, but what each character is. I'll expand on that latter part later on, but for the former, we can explain this one simply. You are not likely to mistake Cecil for Rosa, Rydia for Kain, Taylor for Edge, or anything like that. You might find yourself wondering which one is Palom or Porom, but that aside, each character has traits that make them immediately recognisable. The details on each of the character sprites are also really cool, especially in battle. Rydia's hair clip is quite clear to see. Gilbert, or Edward in the English releases, looks very much like a bard with his troubadour attire. Edge is identifiably a ninja with his face scarf and stern expression. Everything looks surprisingly clear. And even outside of battle, the character sprites are quite recognisable, although these same sprites are limited by the 16x16 resolution, compared to the 24x16 sprites offered up in battle sequences. Consequently, detail comes at a premium and certain things have to be prioritised, but things work out well enough. Hell, you can swap which party member appears during exploration with the right shoulder button, even though it doesn't have any actual gameplay function. It would have been nice if random NPCs said different things to you depending on who you had fronting the party. Really, the biggest difference with the visuals is just how the enemies look now. Just as the character sprites got some big improvements with the amount of detail packed into them, so too did the enemy sprites get a big bump in detail thanks to the increased limit on how many colours could be used. Of course, there is some palette swapping going on at times, but that's not such a big deal necessarily. Trying to work out which particular enemy is which among this army of undead goobers is another thing, but at least they look alright. There is something that I want to talk about with regards to the bosses in Final Fantasy IV, but I'll hold off on that for the time being, whilst we move on to talking about the game's audio. There are a few aspects of this game's audio that can be covered, but I think the big obvious one is the music, so let's get into that right now. You already know the name, this game's soundtrack was composed and arranged by the legendary Nobuo Uematsu. Uematsu had been composing the soundtracks for the Final Fantasy series, and even a few of Square's other projects for a few years up to this point. But one key distinction here is that this is the first game he worked on that was released for the Super Famicom. With this in mind, Uematsu would be capable of changing up how Final Fantasy would sound going forward, given the Super Famicom's greatly improved sound chip, designed by eventual PlayStation legend Ken Kutaragi, and the room it afforded to Uematsu for him to flex his creative muscles. Whilst previous Final Fantasy soundtracks had their high points, to me the game sounded very much like typical Famicom RPGs. They did establish some themes for the series going forward, with such motifs as the battle theme baseline, the prelude and the theme of Final Fantasy, but outside of that, I don't really have much to work with. Final Fantasy IV immediately kicks things off with a new rendition of the prelude, sounding less like an echoey waveform and more like a sampled instrument sound, analogous to a harp or some other stringed instrument with as wide a dynamic range as displayed here. However, Leave it on for long enough and you get a couple additions to the theme in the form of a wind instrument like a flute alongside a violin. Immediately upon starting a new game, you're greeted to another recurring theme throughout the game, the Red Wings. It's a much more sonically complex theme that has a driving momentum to it, alongside the martial feeling of the song itself thanks to its heavy use of trumpets and drums. Just by these two songs alone though, you can tell the game means business right from the very start. Certain motifs will appear at points in the soundtrack that can be used in startlingly different ways. This motif that appears in the main theme, heard mainly on the overworld, can appear in the Land of Dwarves as well, but it also appears in a few emotional scenes with the backing track Sorrow and Loss. On top of that, during certain story moments, themes like the Red Wings can be used in ways that can be particularly intense. One moment it can be quite dramatic as seen in the game's introduction, and the next it can appear as you're fending off your former self. Where this game's soundtrack is concerned, Final Fantasy IV on the whole is elevated by it in a way that's hard to really describe, because whilst later games would give this game's soundtrack a run for its money, the sheer jump from programming waveforms to make specific sounds, to using samples to form a convincing sounding orchestra of instruments is hard to top. If I had to pick out my favourite tracks from this soundtrack, they would be every one of the themes used during battles of different kinds. The regular battle theme elevates itself above past ones by having more going on in the background, whilst having enough intensity to suit most battle situations. The boss theme has a little bit of a sinister vibe to it. Not quite the vibe you would get from later games like in Final Fantasy IX, but there is a lot to it that makes you go, okay, I need to make sure I've got all this organised properly. However, Battle with the Four Fiends outdoes either of the past tracks for intensity. It's a theme that screams business and that you've got a properly tough fight ahead of you. I think it's the timpani in the background that makes this track, as if Carl Palmer was hammering them. Really, that's the thing I associate with this game's soundtrack. Intensity. That's the defining word for how this compares to past Final Fantasy games. The Famicom games' soundtracks weren't bad by any means, and I don't want to make it sound like that's what I'm saying, but Final Fantasy IV sounds like the kind of soundtrack Nobuo Uematsu had been champing at the bit to compose the moment he got his hands on the Super Famicom's audio processor. Just as how this game superseded past Final Fantasy games in terms of soundtrack, later games would supersede Final Fantasy IV, but I would contend that Final Fantasy IV is the first game in the series that sounds genuinely and distinctly like Final Fantasy. Whilst better hardware isn't necessarily everything, there are situations where without it, you're left wanting, and this soundtrack proves it. And now that leaves me with the rest of this game's audio design. There isn't quite as much to say here as there is with the music, but there is still enough here that we can dedicate an amount of time to the game's sound effects all the same. We've got a few different types of sound effects to talk about. There are the sound effects that play during a battle, we've got the sound effects that appear when making use of the game's interface, and sound effects that pop in every once in a while. When using the game's interface, the game will play a sound effect each time you move the cursor. It's a strange sort of sound that I can't quite place, but it's not especially unpleasant at least. It sells the feedback of you navigating a menu if nothing else. As for sound effects in battle, there are quite a lot of them at play. There are sound effects like those that come from physical attacks, such as the bashing of a hammer, the pocking of arrows shot from a bow, the bonking of a rod, or the slashing of a sword or two. What's even more interesting, however, is that certain weapons can have different sound effects tied to them. Cecil's later weapons can sound distinctly different from one another. I'm not entirely certain why this is a thing, but the different sounds sell the properties of each weapon quite nicely. Other in-battle sound effects can include those that are used for magic. The casting sound effect is much the same across every spell or summon, but the specific sounds played will be relevant for what is being cast. Fire magic sounds crackly and harsh, lightning magic sounds sharp, curative magic sounds pleasantly restorative, and so on. For other sound effects that pop in here and there, you have the sound effect that plays when you open a chest to take what's inside, another for when you find a hidden item in some container, another for when you find some thoroughly titillating literature. You get the idea. In truth, outside of battle, sound effects tend to not really feature much. They exist, but they are used sparingly, only when it's appropriate for the moment, be it for comedy or tragedy. Really, the soundtrack in the background is the star attraction where the game's audio is concerned, and incidental sound effects would arguably intrude upon it. Moving on to another section here, let's talk about how accessible Final Fantasy IV is, particularly in regards to this version of the game and the different versions that would spring forth over the 3 decades this game has been around. There is a lot to unpack here, I assure you. The main thing to talk about as far as this version of the game is concerned is its language requirements. For some context, firstly, this is the original Japanese Super Famicom release of the game that I am playing for this review, and Final Fantasy IV is a game I have played several times before in different forms. With this in mind, I feel somewhat qualified to explain that this game is not exactly the easiest to follow if your grasp of Japanese is not great. I did seek out a couple quick pointers here and there if I was lost on something, because it had been a while since I last played the game in English, so I would not call this accessible to non-Japanese speakers by any means. All of the text in this game is in either hiragana or katakana. Now, this is fine, but this is where I should explain the general purpose behind that elusive third element that is notably absent here: kanji. The Japanese language is composed mainly of about 50 sounds, or on, each of which is represented in written language in hiragana or katakana. When you see a string of characters like this, assuming you know the kana, you'll recognise it as saying Sakura, for example. As for kanji, they are, by and large, the meat of the Japanese language, and the number one reason why some people look at learning the Japanese language and go, no thank you. Now, being exposed to kanji as I have been over the last year and a half or so as part of studying vocabulary, I'm somewhat numb to the difficulties kanji can present and instead welcome the positive things they offer. For instance, let's try this example sentence real quick. Mado ga aketan desu kara, Tomo no buya wa samukattan desu. Because the window was open, Tom's room was cold. Written down, we see a healthy mix of the 3 writing systems in Japanese, with kanji used to specify concepts such as window, open, room, and cold. And even if you can't read Japanese, you ought to be able to tell there's a decent flow to it. Now let's try the same sentence again, but exclusively in kana. This is quite a bit harder to parse because, with the exception of Tom, it's just a string of hiragana from start to finish and it all blurs together. It's as if the translated sentence was written as, because the window was open, Tom's room was cold. And this is just one sentence, let alone a whole script. Now, the lack of kanji in this game presents a predicament here. How do you make the text in a story-focused game readable if you can't use kanji? Well, the solution presented by not just Final Fantasy IV, but much earlier games in the series, is to use spaces to separate particular parts of a sentence. In the game, the text would be written somewhat more closely to this. Spaces don't usually appear in Japanese text, but can be helpful for breaking up parts of sentences where kanji is either not wanted or simply not available. It's definitely more readable, though it is still a compromise, one the series and its developers would shed a year later. For now though, this is what we've got, and it can lead to some pitfalls if it is not what you're familiar with. So what's wrong with this whole approach anyway? Well, story concepts, locations, item names and descriptions, and even spells, all being written in kana, can make them a little tricky to track at times. Stuff written in katakana isn't as bad, because katakana tends to be mainly used for loan words, but when you have item names written all in hiragana, it can be tricky to work out what it even does without using it. Not helping things is the issue that spell names, which are mostly written in katakana, don't translate one-to-one into an obviously understandable term. Okay, so pop quiz. What does dejon mean? What does aspiru do? You'll have to refer to the manual for those. It doesn't help that with items there are only occasional descriptions in-game. You get told that particular items will allow you to recover from certain ailments, but you're not told what Bacchus's wine does, what a lunar curtain does, what a silver apple does. It's a bit annoying. It was commented by lead designer and writer Takashi Tokita, whom we'll talk more about shortly, that the original script for the game was as much as 4 times as big as what they finally put on the cartridge. In the end, most of the extraneous text was cut, leaving a relatively lean story that was maybe missing a few details, but we'll touch on the story later. To wrap this particular section up, however, this version of the game is not especially accessible for those not familiar with Japanese. And even if you have at least some familiarity with Japanese, the text can be tricky to understand at times, compounded further by how reliant the game is on you using the manual for item descriptions. So what can we do? Well, fortunately for us, Final Fantasy IV has a tremendous number of different releases and ports over the 3 decades this game has existed. Different versions have different traits that make them better or worse, and this list won't be by any means exhaustive, but let's go over some of the more notable ones anyway. In November of 1991, Final Fantasy IV would make its way to the United States, as explained earlier, under the name Final Fantasy II. There are a lot of things that go on in this particular version of the game that make it stand out, though not necessarily for the best. For one, this version of the game has been not quite gutted, but considerably simplified compared to the original Japanese release. The reason for this was because Square, rightly or wrongly, believed the game unchanged might be too hard for foreign players to adjust to. Because of that, they removed things like Cecil's darkness ability, among others, neutered the bosses somewhat, and due to Nintendo of America's puritanical ways in the 1990s, they removed stuff that referenced Christianity, as well as minimizing any overtly religious terms and concepts. Despite those changes, the story hasn't had any particular changes done to it. The events, characters and all of that are all as they were, just with slightly softened dialogue where the Japanese dialogue might be occasionally brusque. That said, this was from a time before localization was taken particularly seriously, and so the work was actually done in-house, chiefly by Kaoru Moriyama. Because of this, you do get the sense this was translated by somebody whose grasp of English wasn't quite that of a native. Not to say it's incomprehensible or anything, but there are lines that were included which, even in context, don't make a lot of sense. Don't you just hate it when your bars get all spoony and such? 1 month earlier, however, in Japan, a version of the game would release that was based on the soon-to-launch North American localization, Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. There are a few metaphors I could use to describe the differences, but let's keep it simple. Where the localized release is changed in some particularly dramatic ways while still remaining recognisably Final Fantasy IV, the changes introduced in Easy Type are dramatic enough to change the game in a remarkable way. On top of some of the character abilities being removed, the game's script was slightly simplified for children, magic takes less time to cast, the properties of some weapons have been altered to make them more powerful, and enemies no longer take reduced damage from the back row. There are cosmetic changes to allow certain areas and items to stand out better, such as save points in dungeons, and the designs of chests in certain areas are replaced by standard chests to better stand out from the rest of the environment. Those same areas also have a few shortcuts that you can use to make navigation quicker and easier. Enemy behaviours have been altered in places that result in some enemies being harder to beat, ironically, although the sprites that were changed for the localization have been reverted. There was, however, one change, particularly to the final boss, which... we'll leave the final boss for the moment. Anyway, that's all well and good, but I can hear you wondering how you play the original Japanese game, unaltered and unabridged, but in English. Well, the good news is the original Final Fantasy IV received a number of different fan-made translations over the years. The Legends of Localization website has a quite thorough showcase of which of these translations might be better for you, but here are a few key snippets. One of the more famous translations is the J2E Translations release. It is intended to be applied to the original Japanese release of Final Fantasy IV and has been around for over 20 years now, with plenty of changes over the years, including a whole new typeface compared to the one used in the localized release. However, this translation is very much not without its critics. It adds new lines inexplicably, introduces a lot of popular culture references which are very ill-fitting to the game and its world, There are lots of references to sex and even swearing which feel quite unnecessary, and a lot of translation and typographical mistakes show up here. Really, referring to this as a translation is being kind. It's more like a reinterpretation, a different way of telling the story. It has the energy of a late 2000s abridged series that you might see of some anime you watched as a kid. It's a relic of its time, and not one I'd recommend if you want an actual translation. The Project 2 translation is a bit better. Applied to the localised Final Fantasy II, the Project 2 translation serves as an attempt to correct course and try to make a more accurate version of the script by making use of official translations and media that came out after the original Japanese release. Characters that weren't named in the original but got names in later works would have their names introduced here. Terminology would be borrowed from past games in the series as well, and it feels like a love letter to old school Final Fantasy. It's not perfect though. Some text formatting oddities crop up, the terminology that gets used can be archaic as far as the series is concerned, and some terms are rewritten in a way that maintains the removal of religious language, which is a choice? The Project 2 translation was forked off to be used as the basis for another project called Final Fantasy IV Naming Way Edition. It reverts a few of the changes done for Project 2, but it alters enough to be just that bit more accurate, whilst not quite being fully there. The terminology of certain things is modernised to reflect current Final Fantasy convention, and everything is intended to be much closer to the original Japanese release from a gameplay and structure standpoint. It even makes a few typographical changes to allow for more text on the screen where appropriate. If you're looking for a fan translation to play, Naming Way Edition tends to be the one recommended the most, due to what it puts back into the localised version. And whilst it's not the most accurate version of the game from a language perspective, it's good enough that someone wanting something to check out likely won't mind too much. The first version of Final Fantasy IV to release away from the Super Famicom would be the version released on the Sony PlayStation in the wake of Final Fantasy VII's launch in 1997, although it took a while, over 4 years in fact, to release in the West with the excised content restored, alongside a whole new translation. The translation does change the mood of the game a bit, and it's not necessarily for the better. Characters interact in rather inconsistent and even mean-spirited ways, unlike the original Super Famicom game, and there are occasional gaffes. In spite of all of that, however, for the most part it surpasses the original translation. It also includes a full-motion intro sequence. It's very definitely from a time where Squaresoft, as they were known at that point, were starting to come to grips with 3D CG animation, but it's not necessarily terrible for 1997, I suppose. They did better in later re-releases of the Super Famicom games. One difference that's quite dramatic between this version and the Super Famicom original, however, is the load times. The cartridges of the Super Famicom use ROMs that are read pretty much instantly, but didn't have much space at all, whilst the CDs the PlayStation use allowed for high quality audio if you didn't mind increasing the load times. The increase in load times between these two releases feels somewhat insidious, because it might not feel obvious, but it's right there, and that time will add up across hundreds of encounters. Also, the music, whilst unchanged, is out of time and feels wrong. In the end, it's okay, but not a great way to play the game. It's generally easy to get if you know where to look, but other versions that I would recommend are easier to get, and they'll appear very shortly. But first, let's talk about the portable releases first, of which there are a few. This is the first time on this channel that I'm making mention of the WonderSwan here. So, the WonderSwan was a portable console developed in partnership between Bandai and Koto Laboratories, the company that was founded in 1996 by Game & Watch and Game Boy designer Gunpei Yokoi. Whilst Yokoi would not live to see the WonderSwan make it to market, owing to his untimely death in a car accident in 1997, aged 56, the WonderSwan would have a few design philosophies that make it quite an interesting system. For one, it needed only a single AA battery which could last a day and a half, and even though it was still monochrome, its somewhat unusual control scheme permitted games to adopt either a landscape or portrait perspective. Thanks to the early backing of numerous publishers such as Squaresoft, Banpresto and Capcom among others, on top of an almost offensively low introductory price of 4,800 yen, it managed to hold its own against Nintendo's offerings for a little while. Eventually, the WonderSwan Color would release, and with it came a few special packages that included games such as remakes of Final Fantasy. And whilst I don't know if such a package released for Final Fantasy IV, it certainly made its way to the WonderSwan Color in 2002. Now, the lower resolution of the WonderSwan Color ultimately means less of the game ends up being seen at any one time. But that they shoved the whole game onto this funky device with only minor compromises to the gameplay is quite a feat. The biggest and most obvious drawback to this version of the game is the sound quality. Despite being a 16-bit device, the sound chip of the WonderSwan and its successors sounds very much like that of the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. As a result, it doesn't sound fantastic. In 2005, the Game Boy Advance would get Final Fantasy IV Advance. By and large, it is a port of the WonderSwan Color version, and the nature of it being a port of a port introduced a few quirks that weren't present before. Some boss fights could be laggy, the active time battle system would show a few moments of madness, and there would occasionally be jerkiness in using the airship and in scrolling through menus. It was a bit of a technical mess, although upon making its way to the West, it was slightly dejanked. It did feature a couple fairly neat additions, however. If at any point you need to stop playing but you can't simply save right away, you can perform a quick save to temporarily save your progress for you to return to it later. But once you load from the quick save, that data will be gone until you perform a proper save. Another thing is the active time battle gauge. It wasn't something that would appear in the initial releases of the games until 1992's Final Fantasy V, so including it now retrospectively made sense, and serves as a decent little quality of life improvement. Now, unlike the WonderSwan Color version, the music mostly returns to how it once was, although there were a couple minor changes in place, with certain notes having been changed. It might bother you if you're a purist, but if not, you probably won't notice it too readily. We're going to jump forward a few years for the next release, since I want to cover one particular version last. You'll understand why when we get to it. Instead, let's hover to 2011 for the release of Final Fantasy IV The Complete Collection on the PlayStation Portable. This version was how I got into Final Fantasy IV to begin with. Whilst it has its basis in past versions, it differs in a few areas, with the general visual presentation being the biggest difference. Character portraits in text boxes, higher resolution character sprites in both exploration and in battle, gorgeous spell effects, a brilliant soundtrack arrangement, and much more stuff awaits in this version. And that much more stuff isn't just restricted to the main game. It's the complete collection after all. It includes Final Fantasy IV The After Years, a sequel that takes place about 15 years later, which was initially released on mobile in Japan and WiiWare internationally, and an interquel called Final Fantasy IV Interlude. Really, the only downside to this version of the game, in my view, is the occasionally weird presentation. Due to the relatively low screen height of the PSP, it was a near 16:9 aspect ratio device, displaying a game initially intended to output to 8:7, things would occasionally have to move in order for certain sequences to be visible, something the prior releases never had to do. Also, the typography is a bit of a weird mishmash, like numbers that are in a different typeface from every other bit of text, making it look weird, although the Japanese version, being the first version of the game to use kanji in its text, is a neat feature. And now for what is possibly the best version of the game, the 3D remake, which was released for the Nintendo DS in 2007 in Japan and 2008 elsewhere. It was developed by Matrix Software, who were responsible for the Final Fantasy III 3D remake on the DS a year prior, and its success encouraged Square Enix to sign off a remake of Final Fantasy IV. I said that the PSP's complete collection was the biggest change in presentation, but that is nothing compared to this version. The DS remake is a gigantic change, featuring not just fully animated 3D models and well-realised environments, but also a lot of new audio work. It would also come with a wholly rewritten translation. Unlike past games whose English translations tended to be a spiralingly iterative affair, this one is brand new, but differs from the Japanese original quite substantially, in the sense that the English used is a lot more flowery and old-sounding. The end result is characters can talk in a fairly roundabout way to explain performing comparatively simple actions, and it can be a bit of a barrier if English isn't your first language. But I do think that if you can handle a little bit of heavy-handedness, you'll manage just fine. The DS remake would get a new arrangement of the soundtrack, and it would also get a lot of voice acting from actors like Yuri Lowenthal and Liam O'Brien in the English language release, with the Japanese release getting Shizuma Hodoshima, Koichi Yamadera, Norio Wakamoto, and wait, Chairman Kaga? The DS remake is by far and away the biggest change up to how the game looks, although it plays much like past releases did. It is, however, one of the more challenging versions of the game, as tweaks and changes that were applied to other releases to make the game a little easier weren't applied here. This is as close to the Super Famicom original as you can get where the difficulty is concerned, and I adore it. For my money, it is my favourite rendition of the game. It's fun, the presentation is excellent for the DS, and it served as the basis for many later releases, such as the iOS, Android and PC releases prior to the release of the next one we'll talk about, the Pixel Remaster. In 2021, Square Enix would unleash a pretty big project to bring the first 6 Final Fantasy games to a newer audience. In over half a year, each game would be released individually, starting with Final Fantasy I in July and finishing with Final Fantasy VI in February of 2022. The Pixel Remaster of Final Fantasy IV would release in September of 2021 on PC, iOS and Android, with eventual releases on the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4, and later being packaged with everything in a bundle for... oh god, $75? Man, Square Enix know how to charge the moon for this stuff. Anyway, the Pixel Remaster is an update of the visuals of the original game. It feels like an amalgamation of previous versions of the game, with aspects taken from the Super Famicom original, the Game Boy Advance port, the PlayStation Portable release, and even the DS remake. The Pixel Remaster of Final Fantasy IV, just like the other Pixel Remaster releases, includes the original soundtrack as presented on the Super Famicom, as well as a whole new arrangement featuring fully orchestral recordings that sound genuinely fantastic. Really, most of the versions of Final Fantasy IV sound great anyway, but different renditions of the same soundtrack have their unique qualities, and the Pixel Remaster's new arrangements in particular do a truly impressive job of making the game sound fresh. About the only real downside to the Pixel Remaster releases is that they're just recreations of the original versions of the respective games, and therefore don't include the additional content that came with later ports, of which Final Fantasy IV got a fair bit, but that stuff is outside of the scope of this review. So with all of that in mind, I want to say that from here on, things will go into spoiler territory. I will be talking about the characters, the bosses, and the story and its particular events, and I don't want to end up colouring your view on any of this stuff if you haven't played this game before. So if you want to avoid any spoilers beyond anything I have shown out of context in this review so far, I'd recommend getting off here or skipping to the conclusion chapter at the end of the video for my final thoughts on the game. Just know that I fully recommend playing this game in whichever form you can get it. I would recommend either the PSP or DS versions or their derivatives, although the Pixel Remaster is a perfectly good option as well, mainly due to its availability. But really, any version of Final Fantasy IV you can get your hands on is going to give you a great time. If, however, you want to watch the rest of this review for my thoughts on the story of this game, the characters and the like, feel free to continue watching, and we shall head right on into the narrative meat of Final Fantasy IV. Actually, before we do, I would like to take a moment to say that from this point on, not only are there going to be story spoilers, but there will also be a number of instances of flashing colours. They aren't severely intense until the end of the game, but it's worth keeping this in mind. I've tried to minimise them where I could, but there will still be some. Right, onwards. Let's begin with a little bit of background by rolling back on introducing you properly to the designer and lead writer of Final Fantasy IV, Takashi Tokita. Tokita joined Square in the 1980s, whilst initially pursuing a career as a theatre actor. This will be Tokita's first project where he served as the game's designer and lead writer, as Hironobu Sakaguchi, another of the legendary Dream Team, would once again serve as creative director as he had done for the previous 3 entries. The design philosophy for this game centred around making a culmination of the 3 games that came before it. Final Fantasy had introduced story concepts like the 4 crystals that represent the elements. Final Fantasy II had introduced things like chocobos and character dialogue, and Final Fantasy III introduced the job system, allowing players to set up a party of characters with different abilities and traits at will. With that in mind, Final Fantasy IV would take many of the things that made the previous games notable and use them as a solid foundation on which to build a role-playing game built around specific characters who had set jobs, all in the service of telling a story that, for Square at the time, was hugely ambitious. Tokita's familiarity with the processes and artistry involved in stage acting would leak into how Final Fantasy IV's story would be told, as it would easily be Square's most dramatic, narrative-focused and character-driven game at the time. Although Final Fantasy II was the first game of the series to give its player characters their own dialogue, the personality of the characters didn't exactly shine through at all. They were just another way for the players to interact with the world, and Final Fantasy III didn't even bother to tell who in the party was talking. Final Fantasy IV changes this up dramatically. Literally. Because the characters you encounter throughout the game are easily the most characterful in the series at that time. Their job classes, their backstories, the events they go through during the game, their speaking patterns and so on, all factor into their personalities to make them more than just 2D sprites you give commands to. Let's start with the example we encounter at the very start of the game. Cecil is a very capable soldier, as we have seen in the fights on the airship, and could perform his duties as the commander of the Red Wings with ease, although he is evidently troubled by what he did in Mysidia as he returns home. You get the sense of a man who is capable of doing some very dangerous work, but Cecil doesn't want that. He doesn't like that he's heading to a town to deliver a suspicious package under orders of the king he swore fealty to. Along the way in the cave, Cecil and Kain hear a voice urging them to return home and not to make further progress. But of course, they press on to discover that the boss of this area, the Mist Dragon, is the one who was warning them to turn back. After defeating it in battle, they leave the cavern and head into the village of Mist, where upon their entry, things suddenly get very hot. They have basically been sent to carry out the raising of an innocent town. They find a child crying for her mother to wake up, however, she won't wake up. And what's more, she was the summoner who commanded the Mist Dragon in the cave. They killed the Mist Dragon, but in turn, they also killed her mother. In arguing with Kain over whether or not to bring the girl with them or kill her in the name of the king, before Kain assures Cecil that he wants to do right by the Dragoons, even if he has to betray his king to do so, this girl resists, summons Titan, and causes an earthquake severe enough to make the mountains close the village of Mist off from the rest of the world. Kain goes missing, and so Cecil and the girl, whose name turns out to be Rydia, take refuge in the town of Kaipo, and agree an uneasy partnership after he kills a party of Baron soldiers hunting him and Rydia. Handy too, because it turns out Rosa is also in Kaipo, but has come down with desert fever and we need to find a way to cure her condition. This entire sequence alone provides substantially more character than anything the previous games gave us, and this is all within the first hour of the game. We are given the motivations of our main protagonist Cecil, a precocious child with an incredible ability to summon powerful beings and a reason for her using them, and events that will be called back on later on in the story. The characters you gather in your party can range the gamut wildly in terms of personality and backstory. Rosa's motivation to help Cecil in any way she can justifies her being a white mage, whilst the different characters that belong to different towns and empires will have different personalities all around. For example, Yang is a martial artist who focuses on the situation at hand and will do everything he can to ensure a battle is not lost. Edge, a ninja of Eblan, is very different. He can be hot-headed, brash, a bit of a womanizer, and can frequently rub on the nerves of those around him. Palom and Porom of Mysidia, the town you raided for the water crystal at the very start of the game, are twin mages with strong proficiencies in black and white magic respectively. And whilst Porom is always courteous and respectful to her elders, Palom often tries to drag them to his level with his goofy antics that often result in Porom having to bonk him over the head every once in a while. Teller, a sorcerer, is uniquely capable of casting both black and white magic, but his motivations are not those of a kindly magician. Instead, they are fueled by the vengeance he seeks over the death of his daughter Anna. The Bard Prince of Dancian, Gilbert, with whom Anna eloped, struggles to come to terms with her death and his kingdom's destruction and is often fearful of his situation. Sid is a larger-than-life engineer who handles the development and maintenance of Baron's machines, particularly airships, whilst Kane is a stoic, quiet brother figure to Cecil, although he finds himself quite readily manipulated at times, coming as a grave inconvenience to the party at arguably the worst of times. This is a game that is brimming with character, and I haven't even gone over absolutely everything here. It's not really possible for me to do so if I don't want the review to go so long that I end up replicating the game's own length, so I'll keep it at that for now. But you might now be thinking, okay, cool, the game has characters, but what about the story? I won't beat about the bush here. The story of Final Fantasy IV is a bit of a hot mess. It isn't bad exactly, there's a fairly quick flow to it, and it is quite entertaining. But there are a fair number of situations where the events that take place are, to put it as simply as possible, extraordinarily daft. There are, of course, some great moments, so let's take a look at a few. Following an assault on Barbel Castle, where we encounter a changed Kane, as well as, for the first time, our antagonist Golbez, we are advised to take a ship back to Baron in pursuit of them. However, the ship is attacked by Leviathan. Rydia is thrown overboard, and Yang dives in after her. Gilbert and Cecil are hanging on in there, but eventually the vessel is completely destroyed, and everyone is lost, except for Cecil, who finds himself, as if by fate, washed up on the shores outside of the town of Mysidia. The residents of Mysidia are understandably not kind to Cecil. White mages are weary of him and fear whatever it is they expect him to do next, but black mages are outright hostile towards him. Some will even inflict status effects just for trying to talk to them. The only person in Mysidia who isn't hostile to Cecil is the Elder. Talking to the Elder, he senses Cecil's desire to defeat Golbez, but explains that he can't do it as he is right now. Cecil will have to go up Mount Ordeals to undergo a true transformation and become a Paladin. After becoming a caretaker for twins, encountering some crotchety old man for the second time on the mountain, and fighting one of the Archfiends, we'll get to them later, you end up at the summit. A mote of light calls to you, and thus begins your transformation. Atonement starts here, as from this moment on, you have transitioned from the role of Dark Knight to that of Paladin. You are then set up to fight your past self in this transformation. In truth, this isn't a fight as such, instead it is a test of your conviction as a Paladin. You do not win this battle with aggression, but by defense, turning the other cheek as it were. By the standards of what later Final Fantasy games would exhibit, we aren't seeing much of anything that is especially unique here. But back in 1991, this was a seminal moment for the series, because this was the first time we saw a genuine shift in a player character that meant something to not just the gameplay, as the Paladin class removed the darkness ability but provides the casting of white magic in its place, but also means something to the story. Final Fantasy I had you perform an optional quest in order to upgrade your party's classes, whilst Final Fantasy II didn't have solid classes, and Final Fantasy III had the job system, which meant you could change classes whenever you practically wanted. Final Fantasy IV was the first game in the series to genuinely define its characters, and with them, the things they did in combat. In the end, what Final Fantasy IV did here was demonstrate intent. Cecil, your main character, wants to better himself and right the wrongs he is ultimately responsible for, and in doing so, he takes the literal high road, confronts himself, and comes out of it a changed man. Another favourite story moment of mine centres on Rydia. Owing to her village having been razed to the ground by Cecil and Kain, unwilling as it may have been, Rydia has a few trust issues with them, but on top of struggling to trust Cecil when they're together, she also struggles with her magic. She'll initially learn the Thunder and Blizzard spells, but for a time you don't get the Fire spell, and whenever someone suggests she tries to use it, she hesitates. She's understandably traumatised by fire and doesn't want anything to do with it. At least, that is until the party reaches Mount Hobbs to head towards Farbul. However, the route forward is blocked by a wall of ice that we can't break down at all. The only option is to try and melt it, and nobody in the party has that ability. Rydia is once again called upon to try and cast fire. She doesn't want to, it's too much for her, until she's given encouragement from the party. At last, she overcomes her trauma, casts fire, and melts the ice away, enabling the party to move up the mountain. Final Fantasy IV has moments that showcase genuine character building like in this example. For its time, this game was easily the most characterful in the series, and even if later games do this better, this was still leagues ahead of what past games did. One more great story moment is late on in the game. Up to this point, you've made use of numerous different vehicles, like the Enterprise, the Falcon, a hovercraft, chocobos and so on, but all of those limit you in one sense. You can't leave the planet on them. Near the end of the game, you find yourself back in Mysidia talking to the Elder in the Tower of Prayers. Everyone is gathered, and in response, something begins emerging from the water just off the coast of Mysidia. A massive machine called the Lunar Whale. As the name somewhat implies, the Lunar Whale is built to enable traversal between your home planet and the moon, and this becomes especially important later on, as the very last dungeon in the game takes place entirely within the lunar subterrane. By this point, we've explored over and under our homeworld, but now we have a whole other celestial body to explore. Granted, there's not a lot to see besides a crystal palace and a few caverns, but it's a whole new place to explore this late into the game. It even has a Hummingway cave? Yeah, I think it's time to get to the stupid now. Whilst Final Fantasy IV has an impressively told story with a lot of events that take place that raise the bar for video game narratives, it also has some of the most unnecessarily absurd and, to be blunt, borderline insulting things I have seen in a video game story. And I've played through Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes, so that's saying something. Without actively spoiling the events of later games in the series, Final Fantasy came to grow a reputation in killing off some of its playable characters. Final Fantasy II in particular dabbled in this idea by bringing in additional characters that joined you but departed in moments of great sacrifice, but the series wouldn't start trying this with more consequence until later. Back to Final Fantasy IV in particular, as you go up Mount Ordeals and complete your trial, Telar suddenly recovers the spells he once forgot, including the most powerful one a mage can muster, Meteor. However, there is the problem where you cannot cast it in normal play as Telar, because he only has a maximum MP count of 90, and Meteor requires 99 MP to cast. Fast forward to our journey into the Tower of Zot, following one of the more amusing boss fights in the game, we encounter Golbez, and Telar immediately engages him. His most advanced elemental spells, however, are pretty ineffectual and do very little damage to him. He decides the time has arrived for him to unleash Meteor. Those around him warn him not to, but Telar musters all of his strength and unleashes the most powerful spell he has ever cast. It damages Golbez significantly enough to break his control over Kain, but Telar lays dying, having gone beyond his limits to exact his revenge. At last, Telar passes away. This is one of the more emotionally affecting moments in the game, because even though it comes as something to be expected given the circumstances, you lose the only person you've met so far that's capable of casting both white and black magic, and besides, he was an interesting person to be around. But he's gone. For the time, Final Fantasy IV handled this moment very well indeed. But for this time it handled the character's death with grace, there are several other moments where I feel like the lobes of my brain have decided to go on a family holiday to Bermuda. So, sometime after leaving the Tower of Zot and finding your way down to the underworld, you go to the Dwarven Castle, talk to King Jot, and notice that some weirdness is going on in the back of the throne room and offer to take a look. Of course, it's a bunch of dolls, but all of a sudden they turn into this weird, creepy single doll. It's actually a little unsettling somehow, but defeating it isn't terribly difficult. What's more difficult is dealing with what comes up minutes later. Golbez arrives again. This time, however, he isn't here just for a hellish day out. He wants the dark crystal that's here. We engage him in battle, but we're simply outmatched by his sheer magical prowess. We're left for dead. Wait, Miss Dragon? Rydia is back in the party, and she's looking very different. Certainly very grown up looking, considering she's supposed to be single digits in age. Just what are they feeding children these days? Miracle Grow? It's so bizarre. Now that she's back in your party, however, you can go to town on a now vulnerable Golbez by virtue of the fact that not only do you have a useful source of black magic again, but also access to Eidolons. With this, we managed to defeat Golbez at last! Hooray! Rydia explains that when she was thrown overboard in the Leviathan attack, the Leviathan swallowed her, but didn't kill her. Instead, it brought her to a place known in current translations of the game as the Fey March, a fantastical realm in which not only magical creatures reside, but time passes at a much faster rate, resulting in Rydia resembling an adult. You might be thinking, well, it's not that weird, there's a lot of stuff you could say to justify it. And you're right, it's a fantasy game and stuff like this is part and parcel of the experience. But that's not the problem here. Far from it, in fact. The problem is what happens moments later. We try to leave the crystal room to confirm the crystal is safe, but Golbez isn't dead. In fact, he's not only still alive, if only just, but turns himself into his own hand and slowly, agonizingly, as if waiting for the bus to turn up, he crawls along the ground, up the stairs, clutches at the crystal, and absconds. From the moment he turned himself into his own hand to the moment he grabbed the crystal, all of which took place within 15 seconds by the way, we had every opportunity to do the thing Ash did in Evil Dead 2 and stab the hand, but no, we just sat there watching like lemons. Fantastic. Perhaps the worst thing about this sequence, apart from the fact that it should instill King Jot with a sense of distrust in us, given we failed to protect his crystal, is that astoundingly, this isn't even the worst thing this game does in terms of its story. Not by a long shot. Strap yourselves in, because we are about to dive into some real Deus Ex Machina bullshit. Sometime after that part of the game, you are tasked to go to the Tower of Babel. It's similar to the Tower of Zot, except for the fact that you can actually see it in the overworld, as well as in the underworld. An interesting little detail, if I do say so myself. On entry to the tower, you discover that a battle is ongoing between the dwarves in their tanks and the tower's own defense systems. You weave through all of that and start making your way up the tower to find the control room for the defense systems. However, the self-destruct sequence for the control room activates and things are about to explode. Yang, in a moment of madness, decides to shove the rest of the party out of the door and remain inside. Why he doesn't just try to leave, I don't understand, but he's in there now. The room begins to explode and we conclude that Yang had been killed in the blast. We can't make further progress up the tower, so we have to leave, and as the entry bridge collapses amid our escape, Sid in his Enterprise picks us up sharpish. But there's a problem. The Red Wings are in hot pursuit. We have only one option for escape: get back to the surface of the planet. In yet another moment of madness, however, Cid decides to sacrifice himself by throwing himself overboard just as the Enterprise makes its way out of the hole in the ceiling and detonates a grenade that he's holding onto. The good news is this has the effect of causing a cave-in that closes off the underworld from the overworld again, and the Red Wings ship either got caught in the cave-in and crashed, or it got left behind and gives up the chase. The bad news is we have lost our second party member in a very short space of time, and it's questionable as to whether it was worth it. Well, soon after that, we rummage around Eblan and eventually make our way back down to the underworld with Edge, a Prince of Eblan, in our party now. And after leaving the Tower of Babel for the second time, we make our way back to the Dwarven Castle to figure out what to do next with King Giot. That said, we hang around to explore the surroundings, partake in some interesting literature, and see the different places in the castle, including the infirmary where... Oh, are you kidding me? How did Cid survive that? And not only that, how is he in a state to modify the Falcon to fly over lava? The game even starts taking the piss at this point, fully aware of what it's doing by playing the sad jingle, just as Cid falls asleep. It's not even being remotely subtle about it, this is just stupid. Okay, fine, whatever, he's alive. We can now use the Falcon to fly to places that were previously beyond our reach, and eventually we will find our way down into a place called the Sylph Cave, which has the fun addition of floor tiles that will damage us. Good thing we have the levitate spell to float over the... Oh god damn it. We eventually find our way down to the Sylph home and speak to some of the Sylphs who are apparently caring for... Yang? How did he survive being blown up in the control room? Oh, this is where the Sylphs explained they teleported him out of the room just in time. So, as I was saying about Deus Ex Machina, there is, however, one situation that I find to be particularly offensive to my intelligence: Palom and Porom's fate. The Twin Mage's reason for joining Cecil, as it turns out, was to keep an eye on him and see that he is true to his word on becoming a Paladin. Again, the last time Cecil went to Mysidia was to pillage the town and steal their crystal. The entire town, the Elder included, is suspicious of Cecil, and even though he wants to do the right thing, as far as the town is concerned, it's still regarded to be a bad omen. Once Cecil becomes a Paladin, the party returns to Mysidia to report to the Elder, who confirms to Cecil why Palom and Porom went along. Rather than departing, however, they ask to continue travelling with Cecil and Tella. In the end, the party are advised to head out onto the Devil's Road to get back to Baron, where there are a few things to do. On making your way back though, things seem off. Not only has Yang somehow found his way to Baron's Inn, and the party has to fight him to break some kind of mind control, but also the reactions of certain people when they find out Cecil has returned from his travels seem a bit off. Bagan greets Cecil on his way back into the castle and joins the party, but Palom and Porom smell something. Literally, Bagan stinks of being a monster in disguise, and the party have a boss fight with Bagan, which I'll go into later, because it's quite neat and uses a gameplay concept the game makes use of in bosses. Anyway, once the boss fight is over and Cecil laments the loyal Bagans working with Golbez, the party heads towards the throne room to talk to the king, who expresses his dismay towards Cecil becoming a paladin. The king reveals himself to actually be Kanyatso, one of the archfiends who secretly killed the actual king and assumed his appearance. As a result of this revelation, a boss fight takes place versus Kanyatso. Once done, Cid comes and greets everyone and joins the party again. But whilst walking through the throne room vestibule, the party suddenly hears a voice. As it turns out, Kanyatso used the last of his power to turn the vestibule against the party, and the walls now close in and both doors are locked. Everyone is about to be crushed. Well, Palom and Porom, conveniently, decide that it is time to perform the ultimate sacrifice. They hold each of the walls fast, and to stop the walls moving any further, they cast Break on themselves, petrifying them both. Tella tries casting Esuna to undo the petrification, but it fails. Palom and Porom sacrificed themselves to ensure Cid, Tella, Yang and Cecil survived. This is the first time in which we see what can readily be interpreted as the death of playable characters. Because Esena doesn't work, gold needles don't work, nothing works. Which therefore begs the following question. Why, in the name of all that is holy, cursed, and everything that ambles in between, do Palom and Porom come back towards the end of the story? How did they come back? How did someone undo the petrification? Was it the Elder? Did he have some sort of super duper Esena spell or something? A handful of platinum needles in case this situation arose? Just how do you begin to justify this? There's an attempted justification for Esena and gold needles not working in the DS remake, where it's explained that they're ineffective due to Palom and Porom turning themselves to stone by their own volition. But this explains absolutely nothing for how they came back, and the DS remake gave up explaining it anyway. The only importance Palom and Porom's sacrifices had in this game was to open up a couple spaces in the party, giving Cid a spot when he shows up to greet everyone in the Barren Throne Room, rather than make you regret what happened to these children just to ensure you didn't die. This angers me. For a game series that prides itself on its story, and for as well as this game tells it most of the time, Final Fantasy IV's treatment of character death frustrates me so much. Later Final Fantasy titles actually treat important character moments meaningfully, or at the very least they make sincere attempts at it. Here, however, there's a clear hesitance, maybe even refusal, towards committing to it. But, frankly, Final Fantasy II and III did it. They could just as easily have done it here, but ultimately chickened out. By handling character deaths in as blasé a fashion as it does, Final Fantasy IV cheapens the effect. When Tella dies later on, you might be forgiven for expecting his death to not actually be a death, and that he comes back on the moon or something. I just can't be at all happy with any of this. I need to move on now though, because I spent about 3.5 pages of this script whining about how this game treats death as though it's something so trivial, so how about we dive back into something good? When Final Fantasy IV released with its revolutionary active time battle system, one thing that was guaranteed to be made all the more interesting and exciting as a consequence of it was boss battles and the strategies that would be involved. As far as I can tell, the first bosses in Final Fantasy games prior to 4 only had the one form. Garland in 1, the Sergeant in 2 and the Land Turtle in 3 were mechanically simple, easy bosses that only really did basic attacks against you. They were just your first taste of the game, they weren't designed to be a particularly difficult challenge. To call the Mist Dragon in Final Fantasy IV a particularly difficult challenge would be overselling it, but at the same time it was very different from any of the bosses that came before because of how it worked in tandem with the game's ATB system. So to break it down, you have the standard form this boss takes, where you can attack it and do damage, and in turn it will attack you. However, there will be times where the Mist Dragon will dissolve into mist. Attacking the Mist Dragon in this state will cause it to cast the attack Cold Mist, which can do enough damage to Cecil and or Kain to incapacitate them or leave them one hit away from it. So what does this boss actually teach you? Well, the simple thing it teaches you is going in headlong and mashing the A button to attack ad infinitum is going to get you exactly nowhere. For one, some characters' attacks aren't strong enough to really put them in serious contention as a physical combatant. But apart from that, there's timing to consider. In past Final Fantasy titles, you had the opportunity to undo your planned attack before it was carried out, so that you may try a different action instead. In Final Fantasy IV, however, once it's set, it is final, you cannot change it. That safety net is gone, and now everyone is attacking at much the same time as everyone else, so there is not a lot of wiggle room here. And if you mess up the timing on an attack, the game can very readily punish you for it. It sounds unfair, and to a degree it is, but one thing you cannot say about the game is that it doesn't warn you of the effects of poor timing. There are several bosses in the game that take up a secondary state during battle, requiring the player to plan their attacks to best exploit these states. The Archfiends in particular make use of multiple states to indicate whether they're poising for attack or holding back and trying to recover. In the case of Barbaricia, she has two states where she'll either be poised for attack or wrapped up in her own tornado. Any magic attacks in her tornado state will see her sometimes retaliating with Maelstrom, an attack that leaves every party member with health in the single digits. It's brutal. Survivable, but brutal. There's also Rubicante, who has two states, one where he's poised for attack and another where he's hiding behind his cloak. His cloaked state will absorb any elemental magic attacks and recover lost health from them, emphasizing the need to focus attacks at the right time, as well as focusing the right kinds of attacks. As an aside, one cool thing about Rubicante is, despite being a villain, he's courteous enough to replenish your health and magic, and he'll let you walk away and save before you fight him. He's even oddly gracious for someone you're supposed to hate. I wish more games had a villain like Rubicante. There are other bosses that demand maximum awareness from the player due to the difficulty they can pose if you aren't playing how the game wants you to. For example, in the Sealed Cave, you will leave the crystal room with the one dark crystal that hasn't been captured yet, only to be confronted by a wall. A particularly dangerous wall, as it will slowly approach your party and kill each member if you don't destroy it quickly. Dawdle at your own peril with this boss. There are several bosses that make use of multiple targets, whether those different targets are several parts of a whole enemy or multiple different opponents. I mentioned two bosses already that serve as examples. Bagan is an example of the former, whilst Calcabrina is an example of the latter. Bagan's arms are separate targets to the main body, but both perform their own actions at certain points, whether they paralyse party members or cast Reflect to make spellcasting mostly non-viable against him. And of course, if both the arms are destroyed before he is, those arms will be regenerated, adding on another layer of strategy to this battle. The battle in the Crystal Room of the Dwarven Castle is the latter, where you fight against several animated dolls. If you don't eliminate them quickly enough, they will combine to form the aberration that is Calcabrina. And this is where the game can take a bit of a weird and creepy turn. Ignoring the nonsense that follows on from this, of course. One particular aspect of the game I should go into when we're talking about boss fights is how Eidolons come into it. When Rydia rejoins the party after that battle, she has a whole group of Eidolons that she can call upon during battle for a few different effects. What's worth noting, however, is that you won't have access to all that many different Eidolons early on. You'll have a decent selection, but it would be fair to say that you could do better, so long as you know where to look in order to get more Eidolons. You see, you don't encounter more Eidolons through the game by simply progressing the story. In order to get more Eidolons, you have to go out of your way to explore more of the game's world, including the Feymarch, where you will find two Eidolons in the same room, for example. Now, some Eidolons can be found as enemy drops if you go back to previous areas in the game, or you can complete a side quest, like getting Sylph after breaking Yang out of his slumber with a frying pan given to you by his wife, in order to recruit them. In order to recruit some new Eidolons, however, you may have to prove your worth in battle, and each battle showcases what each Eidolon is capable of. Leviathan can summon a tsunami to drown enemies, Asura can cast Raise, Protect or Kiraga on itself to make attacks feel worthless, and Odin and Bahamut can absolutely wreck you if you don't deal with them urgently. Some Eidolons are better or more useful than others. Asura's boon, being as random and unpredictable as it is, makes it a bit too much of a gamble to rely on, whereas Bahamut's Mega Flare can deal significant damage to the whole enemy group, something that can be especially useful later in the game when dealing with more powerful enemies in the lunar subterrane. If there is one thing I would say about this system, however, it's that I tended not to make all that much use of the Eidolons. As useful as they can be, I found it good enough to just focus on Rydia being more of a black mage than a summoner. The Eidolons are good, but in most situations I was in, black magic did the job just fine. Not to say the Eidolons are useless, but As something of an aside, Edge has a similar system where he can make use of ninjutsu. This can be used to do a variety of actions without needing a mage to do it for you, such as your usual assortment of elemental attacks, alongside something like Mirage, which allows you to cast Blink. Blink is a very useful effect for Edge, might I add. Curiously, a couple of Edge's ninjutsu are learned after a mandatory boss fight not long after you recruit him. You get no such situations for Rydia, however, and I'm not entirely sure why this is the case. It feels like an odd decision for the game to take, but that's kind of a theme for Final Fantasy as a series. Usually great gameplay, but with odd quirks here and there. Anyway, let's take another detour with a bit more stupid. Not that this makes me irrationally angry flavour of stupid, but more the this is actually unintentionally hilarious kind. And don't worry, we are approaching the end of this review, but there are a few other details that I want to go over. So remember when Cecil decided he didn't want to be a bad guy anymore and went up a mountain to become a Bishonen? Well, our entry into the chamber at the summit of Mount Ordeals is met with a voice that talks to us, greeting us with the words, Waga muskoyo. What's this all about? Is this voice related to us? Are we actually its son? Where even is this voice coming from and why can we hear it? Well, for much of the game, you're not really given any further context on this particular moment, so you don't worry about it until you find your way to the moon at the extreme opposite end of the game's story. Final Fantasy IV does ultimately fall into the trap that many Final Fantasy games can fall into with their stories, using the end of the game as a massive exposition dump as a way to tie all the loose ends together. This isn't the first to do it, but it's still a weak way to wrap the game's story up. So as Cecil and company enter the Crystal Palace for the first time, we are greeted by a Lunarian by the name of Fusoya. He explains that a number of Lunarians had left the moon to go to the blue planet to seek pastures new, and also introduces a name that comes into play soon, Zemus. Put this one in your back pocket for now, we'll come back to it later. When asked about the lunar whale and how it became a thing, it turns out Fusoya's younger brother, Kluya, had built it. He also explains that Kluya had a number of children on the blue planet. And Cecil is one of them, and the voice we heard on the summit of Mount Ordeals was indeed Kluya's spirit. Oh, and to add to the weirdness, when everyone returns to the planet to tend to the Giant of Babel, a massive hulking machine that threatens to destroy everything despite it showing up seemingly out of nowhere, Golbez shows up after the party destroys the Giant's control systems and is confronted by Fusoya. Fusoya urges Golbez to explain to the party who he is, as much as he resists. And in a moment of post-villain clarity, he gathers his senses and realises that he is the son of Kluya of the Lunarian. Wait, hang on, Cecil and Golbez are brothers? There's no two ways about it, this is just daft. Golbez's relationship to Cecil is not hinted at in the least throughout the game. All you get is him being your replacement as commander of the Red Wings. And even though it is explained how Zemus was able to control Golbez, it's very sudden and lacks build-up. Ugh, whatever. At this point we're about ready to end the game, so the only thing left to do now is return to the moon and prepare for the final assault in the lunar subterrane. However, because of what is to come, and perhaps because of testosterone-fueled ego, Cecil, Kain and Edge stress that it is their task and that Rosa and Rydia must stay behind on the planet. This one is a case of, guys, what is wrong with you? Because Rosa has been an instrumental member of the party in her ability to heal our wounds, whilst Rydia has been a powerhouse of a party member with how readily she has taken down foes with her magic abilities and eidolons. They're not replaceable by items. What are you playing at, boys? Rosa and Rydia angrily leave the Lunar Whale's bridge, whilst the frat party makes its way to the moon. Upon leaving, however, it turns out Rosa and Rydia were still on board, and they made it to the moon with them, so at this point they may as well continue their journey together. And all it took was calling out the boys on their masculine heroism nonsense. The Lunar Subterrane is the final dungeon of Final Fantasy IV. You are free to return from it, but once you enter it and begin exploring it, you are in for a brutal challenge. The strongest enemies in the game congregate in this area, and some of the enemies were boss encounters at one point. Throughout the Subterrane there will be a number of chests that hold some of the best equipment in the game, but there are also a few altars that hold special weapons for Cecil, Kain and Edge. Interacting with these will begin a boss fight to prove your worth, and oh boy, get ready for a beating. If you don't mind too much, it might be worth using the lunar subterrane for a spot of grinding before you reach the final boss. Just make sure to pack a few cottages and a whole bunch of stuff like remedies, because you'll probably need them here. It does mean, of course, that if you need to get a restock on items and whatnot, you might be best off with going and getting multiple stacks of the items you want and shoving them in the ship's onboard fat chocobo if need be, and coming back to the ship if you need to get them. Depending on the version of the game you're playing, there may be more than one save point in the lunar subterrane. In this original Super Famicom version, there is only one, at the midpoint of the dungeon, situated right where the music and scenery are about to change. Approaching the end of the lunar subterrane, you'll begin encountering Zemus's breath. Fighting it is pretty trivial, it's practically free experience, and you can use it to farm some levels if you feel the need. But fighting them takes a while, owing to its constant scanning of party members. There's also Zemus's mind, which has a high enough defense to make physical and most magic attacks worthless. Eventually, the party make it to the final chamber. At the summit are Golbez and Fusoya, taking the fight to Zemus, the wire puller behind the terror that befell the world below. Zemus seems to be taking to the magic attacks well enough, but their double meteor seemingly finishes Zemus off once and for all. At last, everyone can come together and be glad that it's all over at long last. Cecil seems a bit pensive, unsurprising after everything that has happened, but all the same, everyone is pleased that Zemus is no more. But wait, why is his body writhing around like that? Oh, okay. As it turns out, Zemus is dead, but the sheer anger and hatred within him took a form of its own. Zeromus, as it has now become, is again challenged by Golbez and Fusoya, but no amount of magic works against it. They have only one option: use a crystal to make Zeromus vulnerable to attack. Golbez gives it a go, but because of the darkness within him, it fails, and Golbez and Fusoya are wiped out. Everyone is knocked out, and the people of the homeworld are gathered in the Tower of Prayers in Mysidia to offer their faith in Cecil and the party. Eventually, the voices of many people, living, dead or unconscious, make their way to the party, reviving and revitalizing them. Since Cecil, being a paladin, shows his purity at heart, Golbez hands him the crystal for him to make use of. Zeromus is impervious to any attacks early on, but you can at least use this moment to prepare for one final battle. Once Cecil uses the crystal, get ready to face Zemus's ultimate form. Zeromus is a tricky final boss, unforgiving towards your mistakes and unleashes some especially damaging attacks early on. It has two key moves that you need to keep an eye out for, the first being Black Hole, which nullifies all the buffs to your party. And then there's Big Bang. Every once in a while, Zeromus will shake. This shaking indicates that Zeromus is preparing to cast Big Bang, a full party attack that will normally do 4-figure damage. You can reduce the damage by hitting it with a magic attack, but that comes down to getting the timing exactly right. Attacking with magic is a deleterious exercise, as Zeromus will counter, and those counters are separate to its use of Big Bang. Paying zero attention to this is a very quick way to end up running all the way back down the lunar subterrane's lower levels to restart the fight. Good thing it's only a handful of rooms. There is a strategy to beating Zeromus, however. Attack as Cecil, throw whatever weapons you have, even your old weapons, as Edge, jump as Kane, heal as Rosa, and either attack or use Asura if you have it as Rydia. It's a pretty simple process that almost threatens to make this finale a paint-by-numbers affair, But there are a few things going on in this battle that make this boss fight particularly memorable, especially compared to previous final bosses in the series. For one, what an absolute visual feast this is! Granted, Big Bang flashing all sorts of colours does drag it down a bit with how bright and intense it is, but the massive detailed sprite that makes up Zeromus and the background rushing by make for a truly brilliant presentation showcase. Big Bang aside, I love it. The use of music in this entire sequence is fantastic as well. The theme of Final Fantasy makes for a fantastic build-up to the fight, whilst the actual battle music is a fantastic composition that makes you realise that yes, this is it. This is the final encounter. As the fight progresses, Zeromus's behaviour changes, and once it does, it gives you a clue that you are closing in on beating it. Eventually, however, you will strike it one final time. Zeromus collapses, bellowing and stressing that it cannot be defeated so easily as long as evil exists in the hearts of men, even if he was defeated so easily in the end. At last, he dissipates into nothingness. As Foray states his intent to depart into the moon to sleep once more, Golbez asks to join him, stressing he cannot return home after everything he has been responsible for, mind-controlled or not. In the end, Golbez prepares to leave with Foray, but Cecil is reticent to say anything, until at last, pressured into doing so, he bids his brother farewell. As we zoom out to get a view of the solar system, heavenly bodies orbiting at pace, we soon see the lunar whale returning to the waters outside Mysidia. Immediately following from this, we get a coda to wrap everything up, showing the lives of all of the characters on the planet from this point on. Palom continues to be a rebellious goofball whilst Porom tries to keep him in line. Edge and Yang take up their positions as kings of their own lands of Eblan and Fabul. Rydia continues her life in the Fey March, Gilbert oversees the rebuilding of Damcian, and King Jot sees about rebuilding the Dwarven castle. All the while, a contrite Kain stands atop Mount Ordeals, unable to face Cecil and Rosa, who are preparing for their coronation as King and Queen of the Kingdom of Baron. Cid barges into their room to urge them to get ready for the big day. Finally, Cecil and Rosa occupy the throne room of Baron Castle, as one by one, their friends and battle partners greet them on their coronation. The interactions between the characters here are pretty entertaining to see too. It's impressive how much you can do with relatively simple animation techniques. Finally, with all the guests gathered, everyone faces the camera to wave the player goodbye. And credits. Final Fantasy IV is arguably one of the most important games in not just the Final Fantasy series, but also in the history of Japanese role-playing games. It told a rich story for its time, within the confines of the ROM available to it at that, as well as innovating on the gameplay yet again with a brand new system that made combat more free-flowing than ever before. It's a game that has its detractors, and I can understand where they're coming from in places. Some of the story sequences fall flat, and certain character moments can feel incredibly stupid and contrived. But that it still did a good job at making the game's world feel as vibrant and fleshed out as it did is a testament to the work of Square for their first Super Famicom outing. Every now and again, when someone wants to get into a prolific series and doesn't know where to start, it's hard to give an easy answer on what to start with oftentimes. Gundam, as an example, is especially difficult for this, and I'm glad I knew someone who could introduce me to the series, otherwise I would be completely lost. With that in mind, if you want to get into Final Fantasy, I'd recommend either to start with whichever game looks the most interesting to you, or by default, Final Fantasy IV is a safe start. It's a well-paced game that allows you to tune the experience a little bit to your liking. It's more active than a lot of its rigidly turn-based contemporaries. It's got a story that's quite easy to follow along with and is entertaining, if startlingly dumb at times. It's also one of the more readily available games in the franchise. There's a version of the game on practically any platform you could think of. This brings me handily onto the game's importability. Even though Final Fantasy IV didn't quite sell as many copies as the later games in the series, there are still plenty of copies of the game to go around in a variety of conditions. Looking on Mercari via Neokyo, a cartridge of the original Super Famicom release tends to be between 500 yen and 1000 yen, which translates to between $5.50 to $7 or £2.50 to £5. It's hard to say specifically given the current volatility of the yen. By the time this video goes up, the conversion rate will have changed again, I'm sure. Boxed copies can end up costing a fair bit more. Those in poorer conditions can start at around 2,000 yen or $14 or £10, whilst better condition ones can be upwards of 5,000 yen or roughly $35 or £25. Final Fantasy V and VI tend to be a fair bit cheaper by comparison, but they also sold quite a number more copies originally, so it balances out in the end. I mentioned EasyType earlier on in this review, so I should tell you about its own availability for those interested. I bought my copy for £45, and that was the ticket price. He said he couldn't find a copy cheaper than that, and in spite of its condition, I'm inclined to believe him. The cost of the EasyType cartridge itself is quite close to the standard release, if slightly higher due to its reduced availability and more niche audience. Boxed copies are considerably more expensive than the standard release, however, generally starting at 7,500 yen or $50 or £40. I did see a collection of EasyType 5 and 6 for that, but the condition across the board is a bit rough. I already touched on language requirements earlier on in this review, but it won't hurt to reiterate. If you are an absolute beginner with Japanese, you are best off playing a version of the game in a language you know. Text is legible but can be hard to parse, it's not immediately clear what things mean at times, and there isn't a scrap of English in the game. I've already gone over what versions of the game there are, and every version of the game has its positives and negatives. I personally recommend the PSP version, DS Remake or the Pixel Remaster, but if you have an okay understanding of Japanese or at least don't mind fumbling about a bit, the Super Famicom original is not a terrible place to start. And I think that's it for this review. Final Fantasy IV is a very impressive game that, even for its age, still shines as a great example of what the early Super Famicom library could push. It's a game that got bettered by later titles technically, narratively, sonically and aesthetically, but it's hard to not see Final Fantasy IV for the trailblazer that it is. If you have any recommendations for what I ought to cover, please let me know. I'm open to whatever suggestions you may have. I've also reviewed games like Metal Gear Solid and the Ace Combat games on PlayStation, so be sure to check those out. For now though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Ⅳ.